Our next speaker is Adrian. Adrian comes from Zurich. He is a UX designer, UI designer, a speaker, a writer. He will talk about animation, which perfectly fits with Nemanja's talk. Adrian works as independent designer, and currently he is design tinkering at Google and works on projects such as AdWords and Google Maps. Adrian, the stage is yours.
Okay. So, Dobar dan, Novi Sad, or as we say in Switzerland, Guten Tag, Novi Sad. So today I'd like to share a few things with you that I learned about designing micro-interactions. Among others, I'd like to talk about how we can use motion in meaningful ways. So let's initialize this presentation. Animatia, right? So, you know, ever since I started in this field, I had a complicated relationship with animation. Because on one hand, I always really liked it, but I never quite understood why I like it so much. So I started asking around, and I asked, why do you care about animation? And most people would tell me, for them, it's about creating delightful experiences. But what makes an experience actually delightful? Is it when it's effortless, like loading new tweets on Twitter? Or is it when it's seamless, when data is automatically loaded? So I think it's when people experience flow, when they are involved in an experience as a whole. Because when you think about it, interaction models like pull to refresh, they really just keep us in the flow of an app. So a lot of research has been done on the concept of flow, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a great man with a great name, defined flow as the holistic experience that people feel when they act with total involvement. Now, when I read his book, he also writes about how people feel when they experience flow. And it turns out that those people find this mental state extremely rewarding. They find it highly enjoyable. They get a sense of inner clarity and ecstasy. And when I thought about it, the more I realized that pretty much sums up how I want people to feel, people who get in touch with my design. Now, unfortunately, not all animation contributes to flow. A while back, I was looking for plugins for Sublime Text, my text editor, and as I started scrolling to find great content, I saw this. I call them social media buttons on crack. It's a bunch of hyperactive jerks there waiting to be clicked. And if you think about it, it's a really evil technique because we are evolutionarily programmed to look at things that move. So we can't help ourselves but look at those funny little buttons. And then we have this article by The Verge, and The Verge talks about fanboys of different brands. And in this very article, it's about Apple. And as soon as you start scrolling, you get these animations here. You can see how these bubbles animate in. And at first, this is a really interesting experience, but at some point, it becomes really predictable. And as soon as it becomes predictable, you will not focus on it anymore. So let's do that again. As you can see, in the beginning, it's interesting, but then it becomes predictable. So much, in fact, that you probably didn't realize that I had a bar of chocolate here with me. So, you know, we also have questionable animations. Animations where we think, what did the designer think about? What was his idea here? For instance, here on Credit Suisse, you tap on client login, and then you have this show more button. Show more, show less. Let's do this again. Show more, show less, and this interaction should probably be illegal. Now, and then we have the other guys who tell us that we should use the 12 Walt Disney animation principles and apply it to UI design. And what initially looks like this, suddenly looks like this. Now, I don't know about you, but imagine you would have to enter your credit card data in that window. It's not exactly trustworthy. It feels like this interface is made out of soap and bubbles will turn up and something. So I'm not saying that knowing those principles isn't a good thing, but it's also really about asking yourself how far you really want to go. So animation, I find this example here really interesting because it shows how much animation can actually convey. Think of it as body language. We're not necessarily aware of all the subtleties of body language, but it still communicates so much. So aiming for delight is not enough, because today's delight is tomorrow's expectation. I think it's about creating smart interaction, and that's what creates delight in the first place. So I believe that in order to build smarter interactions, we need to start thinking in spatial terms. When we navigate websites or apps, we're often taken from one screen to the next, from one context to the other. But during this whole journey of navigation, we rarely consciously think about how these different screens are actually related to each other. And when it comes to designing digital experiences, it's alluring to think that we're liberated from the limitations of the real world. But as it turns out, nothing could be farther from the truth. George Miller, who is one of the fathers of cognitive psychology, already observed in 1968 that we perceive our surroundings in spatial terms. So when we navigate places or cities, we build mental models just like when we navigate on screens. So when you're visiting New York, for instance, you orient yourself on the Empire State Building, and then you can basically find your position on the map relative to this building. And the people do the same on screens. So in designing, when you design on screen a landmark, that's what they call it, could be a logo, it could be search, it could be navigation. And if those different things are too different from one breakpoint to the next, it often creates a disconnect. And that's why responsive design, it's so important that those screens are not too different. But the most basic example that probably comes to mind is connecting your Mac basically to an external screen. Now when you connect your Mac to an external screen, and your Mac is physically on the left, but you configure it to be on the right. I hope I got the directions right now, because this is the other way around. It becomes a completely irritating experience. Even though you know that what you technically did is possible, you can't make sense of the information anymore. And that just shows how much spatial thinking is ingrained in our minds. When we look at our phone, we see a screen filled with apps, but what's happening in our mind is different. We see a finite number of contiguous screens that are aligned to each other, and you know that you can swipe through them. So now it would be technically easily feasible to restart this interface. When you swipe to the right, then you could always create a loop and start over. But Apple didn't do that. Now, why didn't they do that? Because that's not how reality works. No matter how much caffeine you had, you will not just arbitrarily skip a place and go back to the beginning. You have to do a conscious effort about it. And that's what makes this interface work so well. Now, Apple took the concept of spaces to the extreme when they introduced Mission Control. And Mission Control made multi-desktop so much more understandable because it's highly visual. But it's not always easy to get it right. Let's take this app as an example, one of the many imitations of IA Writer. And as you start writing here, you can see it's pretty simple in the beginning. So let's tap on that hamburger icon in the upper left corner. Cool, we have a side panel. Okay, wait, let's do that again. Oh, there's a second side panel. Oh, there's even another one. And another one. And there are two others. So as you can see, this becomes really irritating because you don't know where this information lives. Where do those information spaces live? We kind of lost connection. So I came up with 5 criteria that I believe makes animation both functional and delightful. We will talk about orientation, about responsiveness, about time, easing, and eventually about personality. So let's give those icons some meaning. Let's start with orientation. So motion establishes relationships in an interface. Imagine this simple page here with a navigation on top, and let's imagine someone would now tap on contact. As you can see, something happened, but we also don't really know for sure what actually happened. And the problem is, the blessing and the curse of navigation is that it can literally take it from one instant to another to somewhere else, and you have no idea what just happened. So moving from one information space to another takes a certain amount of time. And in interaction design, we can represent time with motion. So really, motion becomes the glue that connects those different information spaces. So let's have a look at the same example again, but animated this time. So you tap on contact, and now you see what happens. You know that this is a scrolling interface, you know that you just missed out on content, and when you miss out on content, it's not an accident anymore, it becomes a decision, because you can see what you're missing out. So let's have a look at a real-world example here. This is Ryu theme, one of the most popular WordPress themes at its time, and when you, obviously it has a hamburger icon, so when you tap on that hamburger icon, let's see what happens. Bam. And just like in the example before, we don't really know what happened. So I played a little bit with the JavaScript of this theme and did some small adjustments. Now, when you tap on the icon this time, you can see what actually happens. The website scrolls down, so in order to leave the menu, you actually have to scroll. Now, is this a good interaction model? That's another question. But the animation definitely makes it unambiguous, so you understand what's happening. So motion is in many ways not just a detail, it can actually make or break the experience. Morphing an icon from one state to another isn't just a delightful detail, it's crucial to understand what's happening next. When you tap search on quartz.com, you get this huge blinking cursor. And this huge blinking cursor is kind of like a friend saying, hey, come, type something, I'm friendly. And that's not bad for a blinking line of pixels, right? And it's just because of this simple animation that it communicates so much. So motion creates orientation through relationships. We've come a long way in interaction design. If you think about the early days, we always used those nasty pop-up windows for everything, whether it's a settings panel or an update panel or whatever. And then we started to understand that there is a better way to do it, a way that maintains context. So today we seamlessly transition from one state to the next. Like in this example, tapping on the watch opens up its detail page. And you can observe it. That's something that Google Material Design Guidelines strongly encourage. And these concepts have become more and more refined the more we learned about them. For instance, this example here is from the first material design spec. And when you tap on an image, you can see how it opens that image from a side panel. This was later replaced by this one. As you can see, the new screen, did you actually see it? Okay. So the new screen now appears from the origin of the interaction, and that creates a much better connection between the user's action and the next screen. So animation can also be used to to fix change blindness. For instance, how do you create a relationship between this item here and the item in the upper right corner? So what the guys here did is you add this thing to the brew list. I'm a huge coffee geek, obviously. And then it goes in the upper right corner and it establishes a relationship. Even though you wouldn't necessarily know that this goes there, you can create this relationship. So lately everyone is talking about conversational interfaces, chatbots, everything is everywhere, right? To the point where it actually became kind of scary. So I asked a question on LinkedIn. What's your plan after chatbots take over and UI designers are no longer needed? And then Rafael Liederitz, Director of Product Management at Google, simply answered, fire you. And you know, that wasn't exactly the answer I was hoping for, but it really had some truth in it, right? Where do I fit into the picture when conversational interfaces would take over? And so instead of being worried and scared, I decided to try an experiment. I made my website conversational, and this is how it looks. So when you go to my website, you will see this scroll if you don't feel like talking, and if you don't scroll, it will actually start talking to you. So in this case, you can see how those bubbles animate in, and those animations were incredibly important because those animations made the product feel like an actual conversation. Whereas if those things would just pop in, it wouldn't feel like a real product. You would think, oh, okay, nice idea, but it doesn't really work. And so in this case, what can you do here? So you can now choose from two options. You can either choose Tell Me More or you can get in touch. So let's tap on Tell Me More. Let's tap on Tell Me More. So this is actually really interesting what happened here. That animation here was incredibly painful to build. It was really tricky, but it turns out it was also really important because this very animation changed the way people felt about the conversation. So lots of people ask me, which natural language processing technology did you use to build that chatbot, which was ridiculous because it's just a scripted conversation. But as users were able to observe how their interaction affected the conversation, they believed that those were really their own words. And that's why so many people ask me that question. So animation can not just create orientation, it can literally change the way we feel about an interface. All right, so let's talk about responsiveness. So in UI design, a responsive interface is an interface that immediately reacts to a user's input. It can take advantage of motion to do so. Now, Microsoft recently announced their new anticipatory design technology. This technique uses proximity sensors in the phone to make the device more responsive. So let's check it out. And actually, I'll apologize in advance if it's too loud. And I also apologize in advance if it doesn't work, which clearly seems to be the case. But we have a backup plan. So let's do that here. Do we have any sound here? Gotcha. I already did. It still doesn't work. Let me just audio device, HDMI. Yeah. Okay. So let's see if that works. Still doesn't work. All right. Yeah. It started off so well. I was so hopeful. And then it just didn't work. Yeah. All right, you know what?
Capacitive touchscreen.
Okay, let's do this.
We explore pre-touch sensing for mobile interaction. This emerging modality uses a self-capacitive touchscreen to sense multi-touch above the screen, as well as grip around the outer edges of the device. Anticipatory techniques proactively adapt the interface to the current grip and the approach of the fingers. For example, our prototype video player has an ad-lib interface that spontaneously presents interactive elements just in the nick of time. Initially, there is no interface. The video is the focus of attention. But when the hand approaches, this indicates a change in context, and so the controls fade in. Yet, the interface recedes into the background when the user moves out of proximity. However, if the user holds the device one-handed, only a subset of the controls come forward, and in a manner particularly suited to the thumb. Instead of sliders, the user dials to scrub through the timeline, or adjust the volume. While holding the device in the other hand brings the controls to that side instead. With the second thumb, a richer set of options becomes available, and is distinct from a pinch to zoom, which again fades out single-finger controls.
That's pretty awesome, I think. I think that's pretty awesome because it will allow us to build new kinds of interfaces once this thing actually becomes available. So let's see how we can get back to the presentation. So technology in browsers now enables us to do crazy things. We can now have access to ambient light sensors and change a website's design based on the user's ambient light condition. And technology in general allows us to do all those amazing things, but sometimes we can get away with simple tricks, which have just as much impact. For instance, if you have incredibly bad signal and you send a message on Twitter, it always happens immediately. Now, how do they do that? Now, the reason it works so well is because they will always animate the message just like it would actually have sent already. But what's happening in the background is actually a different story. Is this playing? Yeah. So what's happening in the background is a different story because the interface only interrupts you if the message actually fails to deliver. And that creates a much better flow because you can already start typing your next message and the interface will not block you. But animation can also be dynamic. Scrolling through an interface can adapt it to react to changes. We see this every day when we scroll through Safari, for instance. When you scroll down in Safari, the interface becomes smaller. And as you scroll up again, the interface becomes taller because it indicates a change in context. You want to do something else now. And all those small little adjustments can really add up. If you go to TED.com, they have a similar pattern. As you start scrolling down, you see the video in the upper left corner. So if you want to read the comments or the script, you can always have a glance at the video so you can keep the context. So we can also use animation to progressively show content when needed. This is the float label pattern, which is pretty famous by now. But what's so interesting about it, I think, is the way it works. Because one of the problems of placeholder text is that once you start writing, you actually overwrite the placeholder. So once the user is finished typing in his data or her data, she has no more way to control her own, to validate her own inputs. So in this case, what we do, we seamlessly animate the label in, and the animation here is really important because it reinforces the model that this is the same data. Without the animation, you would just think it's nice, but this actually creates a seamless connection between the label and the placeholder. And then we have this last example here, which I think is just amazing. It's from WhatsApp, and when you want to send a voice message on WhatsApp, the interface is incredibly responsive. So you tap on the voice icon and you can see this subtle slide to cancel animation that explains you how the interface works. So let's do that. And then you have the microphone icon, which goes into the trash bin. So this animation we just saw is not just an animation, it's a tale of a voice message, a tale we remember, a tale we'll tell to our grandchildren. And then we have time. Animation and movement is all about time. And ironically, we perceive time to be something spatial as well. When we talk about time, we talk about it like it's something spatial. We say things like, that's still in front of me, or that's behind me. Or when we think about days, we say yesterday was here, whereas tomorrow is here and today is right here, right? So when we draw a timeline, those of us who speak English will put the past on the left. Those of us who speak Arabic will put the past on the right. And those of us who speak Chinese will put the past at the bottom. And so, since we perceive time as something spatial, it also has a few implications in the way we design interfaces. For instance, when we move from left to right in an interface, it subconsciously communicates that you're progressing towards your destination. And that's why most drill-in navigations work that way, because you can feel that you make progress. If this would be the opposite around, for most people it would feel strange. So, but there's more to it. Duration can also affect interpretation. So research shows that we perceive duration in different stages. For instance, 100 milliseconds feels like something is reacting instantly. 1 second feels like you could still feel the delay, but you're kept in the flow. Whereas 10 seconds is the user's average attention limit. So what's the ideal duration in terms of animation then? The sweet spot for most animation will usually be in between 100 and 300 milliseconds. And if you go higher, you better make sure you have a good reason. Because if motion slows down the experience, you're really doing it wrong. There's nothing more annoying than a designer that forces you to look at their little animation over and over. It actually makes you delete the app. But it also depends a little bit on context. For instance, when you go to New York, 90% of all the crosswalk signal buttons there do absolutely nothing. But they're all still there. Now, why are they still there? Because it feels good. It feels good to be in control. Or at least it feels good to the idea of being in control feels good. So motion can do the same thing. motion can affect time perception. For instance, frequency variation is known to affect people's perception of time. So when a progress bar is animated, it can change the way we feel about it. Ribbings moving in the opposite direction of the progress creates a very intense illusion, whereas people think that the application is actually loading 10% faster than it really is. But time can also change the way we feel about features. When Blogger relaunched their site, they had the classic traditional sign-up flow, and at the end of the sign-up flow, they had a create blog button. And people are obviously very excited to push that button, right? So what happened when people pushed that button? Well, what happened is that it would immediately create the blog. And then people were really unhappy. Well, that was so fast. How is that possible? Something must be wrong here. So what did they do? They introduced nothing but a page that would show this animation for a couple of seconds. And then suddenly people loved it. People loved it because they felt like, I'm really glad Blogger is doing the heavy lifting for me. I could never do that. So duration can in many ways add significance to our interfaces. So easing is another crucial ingredient of good motion design. The way you stage and ease your animations can change the way what they express. But somehow this always reminds me of what my friend from IA once said. He said that out of all hand throwable things, socks have the most unpredictable trajectory. That's from Lorian Gridinock, creative technologist, very wise tweet. And I think what he really wanted to say is that socks is interesting to throw around because it follows the laws of nature, the laws of gravity and physics. Their trajectory is always different. Now, unfortunately, computers couldn't care less about gravity. So without some love, animation will most probably look like this. Robotic, boring, and most of all, unnatural. And that's where motion curves come into play. So what are motion curves? So motion curves define how an animation behaves over time. And my friend Isara, who is an After Effects instructor, always told me that I should imagine that a motion curve is like somebody snowboarding down a hill. And I'm from Switzerland, so I really like that idea, you know. So let's see how this looks like. Let's send someone down the hill with a flat motion curve. So what happens here? Ugh. That was terrible. It's linear, it feels unnatural, it's pretty bad. So in this way, what do we do? And that's when we usually start fiddling around with the animation curve, right? So we will pick this, and we probably want this to be faster in the beginning and slower in the end. So we just drag this down and see how this looks. Now let's look at the same thing again, but with a different motion curve. Now, as you can see, I cheated a little bit. I created this zoom in effect for the extra drama, but you get the picture. And the animation is still not perfect, but it takes a lot of time to do this, and that's exactly the point, because good motion design takes time. There's no way that we can create great animation without investing a lot of time. So if the motion curve isn't right, the animation won't delight. Now, I'd really like you to repeat this. If the motion curve isn't right, awesome, thanks. So, why is this important? Because in the real world, things don't move in perfect unison. And not all animation grabs our attention in the same way. So these two squares here, they have the exact same animation duration. But let's look at this for a second and see what happens. As you can see, you first focus on the right square, but then at the end you can't help ourselves but be focusing on the left square. Why is this happening? Because the left square motion is more dramatic at the end. And we can use this knowledge to orchestrate animations on the screen. So if you have many things that need to move around in your interface when you go from one state to the other, always make sure that the last element on the screen that is animating is where you want the user to focus. It's a simple trick. So again, if the motion curve isn't right, the animation won't delight. I really like that. So, and then we have personality. And personality comes at the very end of the design process. When you start thinking about personality, you really want to think about what you want your brand to say. Do you want your brand to be playful, or do you want it to be very serious? I I was really fortunate to having met Don Lindsay last year, and Don Lindsay was the senior vice president of Apple back in the days when they released the very first version of OS X. And he told me that the idea of OS X Aqua was that it should feel liquid, that it should feel like water, that it should be lickable, as Steve Jobs would say. And what's interesting, so I let you check it out yourself here.
This is the dock. It's at the bottom of the screen. It always stays centered, and it allows me to put things into it. I can put all sorts of different things into it. How do I put things into it? Well, I can drag things into it, but let me show you a much cooler way to get things into it. I've got these three buttons up here. One closes the window, the other maximizes it, the third minimizes it, the middle one. Where does it go when a window minimizes? Well, it goes here. And you notice my dock just grows, right?
So you can hear the audience reaction. And that's 16 years ago. So when people saw this animation for the first time, they didn't think that was possible. That was huge. Developers must have hated the designer who had the idea about this animation. Imagine you had to write this. It's insane. But it also shows how much Apple already at the time invested in motion design. So animation can also be used for rewards. For instance, every time I have inbox 0 in my inbox app, I get rewarded with this very animation. It's a small animation, it's just 3, maybe 4 seconds long, but it creates a delight. It creates a lot of delight, and every time I swipe through my last email, I'm looking forward to seeing it. So each time I see it, it reinforces the fact that I should keep my inbox low. And that's exactly what animation can do. I actually use this quite a lot in my work. So when you have like difficult things that users need to accomplish, you can reward them with animation. It can make the experience more delightful. And when Facebook Paper was announced, people went crazy. Facebook Paper's motion design made it stand out from all the other apps at its time. It was extremely fluid, it was extremely responsive, perhaps even a little too responsive sometimes. And Paper had good intentions with its motion design. However, we all know how it turned out. It wasn't exactly a success. And if an application looks beautiful and even works well, but there's no substantial benefit in using it, then animation will not save our asses. So animation can support the experience, but animation is not the experience. And then we have animations we just won't forget. Animation can be really emotional. In this case, when you enter your password on readme.io, you can see that the owl covers its eyes so that you can safely type your password. Or then we have Yacht Quest. Yacht Quest is a proposal for an app that I found on Dribble for boats. And the loading indicator here works perfectly fine in the context of boats. So personality isn't the experience, it enhances it. So we've covered a few points here today. We started to talk about orientation, how the spatial perception of our environment can change the way we think about animation. We talked about responsiveness, how animation isn't just static, but that it can be dynamic and dynamically improve the experience. We talked about time, how we can use animation to change the perception of time. We also talked about easing, how we can use easing to grab users' attention, to orchestrate focus. And then eventually we talked about personality, how we can use motion to give a product a soul. So I think combining all of these principles allows us to create animations that support rather than break the experience. Animation is still a relatively young topic, but it's now happening. With browsers that have a really sophisticated animation engine today, we can create all sorts of things we always ever dreamed of. But it also comes with a lot of responsibility. So hopefully some of these principles we discussed here today were useful to you, and hopefully you'll think about them the next time you add motion to your project. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. This was really, really awesome. So let's start with the question. Who will start first?
First question gets a bar of chocolate.
Okay, Come on. I don't want to take that chocolate. Yeah, it
Doesn't
is melted
count.
probably. Okay, questions? Okay. Can you just
You don't want the chocolate? Okay, that's great. That creates a lot of motivation for the next person. So I will just repeat the question. Let me know if I understood that right. When do you draw the line to add motion to your project? Yeah, so that's actually a good question. So one of the things about adding motion to your project is that it's also really dangerous. Because when you add motion too early and you show this to a project manager, they were like, oh, that's awesome. And they completely forget what this is actually all about. So they will not look at the data anymore, they will not look at the navigation anymore, they will just think, that's awesome, that's a great UI designer. So don't add motion too early. I'm actually really glad you asked that question. But to make it a little easier, I think like tools like Keynote, for instance, the presentation software, is really a great start to animate because it forces you to make animations that are not like incredibly detailed. You can get the basics right, you can communicate the basic idea of the animation, whereas you get into detail later on with more capable tools like Framer, like Principle, like After Effects, even if you want to go nuts. But that's pretty much the idea. Was that more or less? Okay. Awesome. You deserve it. I'm glad it's the first row. I would have to. It is. I will come and get it back. Yeah. So a friend of mine runs a design studio in Zurich, and he actually got the exact same question about research. How do you show the client that you do user research? And he said, no, we just do it. It's part of the process. It's part of the budget. And whether you want to tell the client that you spend a lot of time animating an interface is your choice, I think. But I also think that you need to work with clients who want you to create great work. And if those clients are ready to, if you get a budget that's reasonable, it allows you to do great work. If you don't have a budget that allows you to do great work, then you have to ask yourself whether you actually want to do it, right? So in my case, I really tried very hard. Sometimes, like as a freelancer, I think it's important that most people, they bill by the hour. Right. So billing by the hour is really simple because you can just, as you work, you send an invoice at the end of the month. Everyone is sometimes happy. But what I personally do sometimes is, if this project is important to me, and hopefully that's always the case when you're working with clients, then I actually sometimes just spend time working on these animation things, and I don't even bill it. I don't even write it. I don't even note it down somewhere. I just do it because I care about the project. But I guess there's no best answer to that.
I work as a developer, and I would like to probably have some suggestion, like what to do when designers send like too much animation. I mean, how to deal with it.
Too much animation?
Yeah, there are designers that they see those animations that you show an example, and they want all of them on the web page.
Yeah.
How to deal with those kind of
Okay. So the question is, the gentleman here is a developer, and he has to work with designers. And he has to argue with them, how can you stop designers from going crazy about animation? It's a good question. I guess one of the things you could do is that you just keep asking them why. You keep asking them why as long as you can until they run out of arguments, because asking them why as long as you can will force them to come up with really good reasons why they actually chose to animate this interface in the first place. And if they don't come up with great answers, it's a really destroying process because they can literally feel how they're running out of arguments. And I think that's a technique that works really well. Another thing that you could do is to tell them, you're insane. But that's my approach. I don't know, it probably doesn't work for anyone. Let me know how it went. Maybe start with the first approach.
I will ask the last question, I guess. I'm interested, so when you finished with your animation, it's not like you have to look at it 1,000 times and you'll be sure that that's the good animation. How are you tested out? How do you get to that point that you're sure that that's a good animation? Are you letting other people give you a comment, or how do you say that this animation is great, it's awesome, it's useful, it's not too long, it's not too short? I mean, are you testing it alone, or are you letting other people to test it?
Yeah, so when I work, so on my project at Google has an extensive testing process where we test, where all the interfaces get tested. So obviously this is a really nice situation to be in because you can test your animation, you can see if it works. Now as a freelancer, what I often do is what I call socially awkward research. So you go to a coffee shop somewhere and then you ask some people for an opinion. And they don't have any background whatsoever about what you're actually trying to accomplish, but they can see the animation and they can learn how it works, and then they can give you feedback from an aesthetics point of view. So this works really well to see if people like the animation from an aesthetics point of view. But to find out if the animation is actually useful from a functional point of view, you have to test it in a real user study. That's the way I do it. But it also depends on the animation. If your animation is extremely experimental, then you obviously have to do more testing. But if it's just a basic fade in, fade out, if it's a less dramatic effect, you probably don't even have to run a user test. So it really depends on the motion design that you have in mind.
Thank you. Okay, one last question maybe. Does anybody have it?
Sorry? I didn't, because it was an experiment. And that's actually, yeah, that's interesting, because usually when we build things on the web, right, we have tons of examples where you can copy from. Basically what we do is steal, right, and then we call ourselves designers. That's what we do. But in this very case, it was really hard because I had some inspiration. I had Quartz as an inspiration. I had WhatsApp and iMessage as an inspiration. But then I had to figure out how will I make this a conversation to feel like there's an actual person behind it, like that people actually feel like they're talking to me. And for everyone in this room, I can really recommend building your own chatbot, because chatting with yourself can really, you start learning a lot about yourself. And what happens, so in this case, what I learned is basically that when you build something new, that hasn't been replicated dozens of times, you just need to explore and you can't really test it. In this case, I didn't really test it because it was also kind of an experiment. It was a joke. In a corporate environment, that obviously wouldn't work. But as a joke, I think you can get away with it.
Okay, no more questions. Sorry about it. Thank you very much. This was really awesome.
Thank you.